Hello everyone, today we talk about the kingdom of the East Saxons, known also as the kingdom of Essex as a matter of fact, but the proper name, as you know, of the Anglo-Saxon heptarchic polities, except the word just 7, aside from the later kingdom of the English, was in fact actually called after the people. And so intended as a realm, right, of this particular population, not the name of the land per se. It doesn't matter, that of course the land took the name after the people, but there is an important change over, say, the centuries and the way, of course, in which political and territorial rule was seen. Lots of, cultural, moral things, of course, changing. But I'm not going to discuss this specifically, just going to lengthen a bit the thing, because, telling the truth, albeit the kingdom of the East Saxons, of course, deserves great consideration, it's also less known than the others. At least less things were actually going on in the first place for us to document, and it was definitely a modest power. Right, we've seen, for example, already the kingdom of the Kentish, that at least at the beginning of the Anglo-Saxon England, let's say, was capable of achieving an hegemonic position at a certain point. We have seen in other videos about, the kingdom of the East Anglians, for example, a bit of Angles, the borders fluctuating a little bit in a more expansionistic direction. Here the picture is not just one of fundamentally a relatively defiled policy, but also one that was floating a little bit politically and territorially, and that fundamentally went under the domination of other heptarchic powers. Nevertheless, the East Saxon Rike, or Rike if you prefer, the Regnum Orientalium Saxonum, was one of the 7 traditional kingdoms of Anglo-Saxon Britain, existing between, we can say, 527 until 825, when it was ceded to the kingdom, to Ecgbert, the king of Essex, of the West Saxons, after actually some important interference from Mercia that in fact would retain some control even after the rise of Essex. This kingdom occupied the counties that were today's counties of Essex, Middlesex, and of Hertfordshire, and even for a short while West Kent. This kingdom was bounded to the north by the River Stour and the kingdom of East Anglia, to the south by the River Thames and Kent. Right to the east you have the North Sea, and to the west Mercia. The country included the remains of 2 important provincial Roman centers, Colchester and the same London. In fact, part of the territory, occupies parts of today's eastern metropolitan area of the British capital. Now, the kingdom included essentially the Middle Saxon province, or Middle Sax, which included the area of the later county of Middlesex and most, or if not all, of the Hertfordshire. Hertfordshire, however, albeit being ever recorded as part of the East Saxons kingdom, it was not part of their core territory. And this is evidenced by charters that basically are granted in the core land, but further west, these were issued only making reference as documents to their Mercian overlords, So what we see is at some point naturally an overlapping, Mercian control, not just on Essex, but also a multiplicity of rulers within the same Essex, right? That doesn't appear particularly compact reality, as at least in its outskirts had fundamentally other chiefs that ruled in a at least autonomous fashion, right? So these were co-kings, right? We can't think, of course, there was an East Saxon political identity and customs, etc. But this system wouldn't follow a unitarily monarchic profile. There were different leaders with a main one in the core lands, and this others that basically had a joint rule with them in their own particular territory. The links to Essex between Middlesex and parts of Hertfordshire were long reflected in the same diocese of London that was re-established right from antiquity in 604 as the East Saxon See, right? And the boundaries of the London diocese continued to be based on the former ones of the East Saxon realm until very late in time, the 19th century. The East Saxons also had some control for the western Surrey, that is other county in the southeast of England. For a brief period in the 8th century, the kingdom of the East Saxons controlled West Kent, as was hinted at before. So when you look at the modern county of Essex, you realize that at least the northern and southern borders correspond to the historical ones in Anglo-Saxon times. And however, it still covers the territories east of the River Lee, the other parts having been lost to Mercia as early as the 8th century, and thus having historically pertained to another administrative sphere. So when you look at the tribal hidage, that, as you know, is a list of 35 tribes that was compiled in Anglo-Saxon times, and we don't know when, actually. It could have been as early as the 7th, as late as the 9th century. And it shows basically this number of properly of unit of land measurement that naturally doesn't necessarily, it's like the manses, a standard unit of land measurement that could not be just in terms of extension. Traditionally, they say it's 120 acres, but it could simply measure even just the wealth of a given plot. In any case, comparatively, the kingdom of the East Saxons contained 7,000 hides. Just comparatively, consider that Wessex counted 100,000 hides, East Anglia 30,000. So this gives you the measure of how limited East Saxon power was compared to its neighbors, and why it followed this history. As we were saying at the beginning, we do not have much documentation. There is no intense charter issuing. There is no version of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. In fact, the only mention in the Chronicle regarding this land is the one of the Bishop Mellitus, that was actually the first bishop of London in the Saxon period, the third Archbishop of Canterbury, and a member of the Gregorian mission that had been sent to England to convert the Anglo-Saxon to Christianity. Here, right, we're talking about the very beginning of the 7th century. As a consequence, you understand, it's just like minimal references, few administrative charters, and we know relatively few about that. That's the reason also why it probably was particularly powerful in the first place, and it went under Kent, East Anglia, and especially Mercia on the longer run. For the rest, the kingdom of the East Saxons follows a pretty standard kind of pattern of Anglo-Saxon
conquest, settlement, aside from possible previous groups, war bands that could have settled even centuries before, the Saxons began to land in part at the time of the 2nd century, under Roman control, etc. But the earliest evidence, generally speaking, also is highlighted by scholarship of a Saxon takeover from the migratory waves of the time had begun by the early 5th century. We can notice Macking as one of the most important locations. This is especially an archaeological site near the homonymous village in southern Essex. And a large proportion of these original settlers came from properly Old Saxony. Of course, there may have been other elements without doubt, but that's mostly the source that we identify. According to this British legend known as the Historia Britonum, right, which is a purported history of the indigenous British people, written essentially around the early 9th century. The territory known eventually as Essex was ceded by the Celtic Britons to the Saxons following the infamous treason of the Long Knives, an account of a massacre of British Celtic chieftains by Anglo-Saxon soldiers at a peace conference on the plain of Salisbury during the same 5th century. Probably a pseudo-historical event. This would have taken place especially around the 60s of the 5th century, during the reign of the High King Vortigern. So this essentially a Romano-Britonic warlord of sort that would have coped with the Anglo-Saxon invasion, and that is at least profiled in the writings of Bede the Venerable, Gildas, and, right. So whichever the background, legend or not, doesn't matter. That's how it actually happened normally, right? There is surely a continuity of the East Saxon settlement with the pre-existing Roman districtuation. This land would have been inhabited by the Trinovantes, one of the Celtic tribes, in fact, of pre-Roman Britain, eventually becoming a civitas, right, in southeastern Britain. And it's quite likely, at least from the few evidence that we get, that the Saxons, just like basically in all the other Germanic migratory patterns in Western Europe, simply came with as a minority, as an armed minority that managed to take control, right, politically and militarily over a much larger Romano-Britonic population, which was essentially, if not completely okay with that, but at least wasn't essentially changing radically their way of lives. And actually, this seigneury helped stabilizing the local country after the pretty dark things that had happened independently from the Anglo-Saxons after the Romans had left the island. So it's a pretty smooth installation. We do not know of particular clashes in the area. We don't see even that archaeologically speaking. Again, it would be difficult to, but that's our best knowledge. The kingdom of the East Saxons grew further by the absorption of other chiefdoms, we can say, both of Romano-Britons and of Saxon tribal groups. Right, that's how they came, different clans, war bands, and they had to make up a, more stable territorial power, which was quite different, right, as a broader political and social landscape from the one they were coming from in continental Germany. And and therefore, in this sense, there may have likely been more infighting among them than actually with the local resistance of sort. We have a set of locations that may have, given their toponyms and other historical and archaeological evidence, may have hosted smaller chiefdoms or tribal groups, such as the Rodings from the people of Rotha, the Heimele, that would be Hampstead, Vange, the Marsh district, maybe stretching to the Mardyke, which is a small river, mainly in Thurrock, that flows eventually into the Thames at Purfleet. Vange, Ging, here you can't pronounce a bit the French or the German way. Berekingas, in fact, Barking in the southwest of the realm, Eiferingas in the London borough of Havering, so we are in East London here, Appingas, that would be Epping, so of course the Germanic toponym here is pretty strong, as you notice, and these were all lands surely of early settlement that were eventually absorbed by this broader kingdom of the East Saxons. Now, Essex emerged as a single kingdom out of this process. During the 6th century, we do not know much about this. Basically, anything about the early Essex kings, like dates, names, exploits, are merely conjectural, right? This is normal to a degree for most, at least, of early rulers in the Heptarchy, but the historical identification of the Eastern Saxon kings is a matter of debate, in a sense. The local dynasty that managed to firm itself, because tendentially the process of territorialization had brought to this essentially monarchic direction that was alien to most of the newcomers back home across the sea, claimed descent, as I usually did, like from Woden himself, via this essentially national god of the Saxons, Saxnat or Saxnot, of the Germanic mythology. So, of course, a stock of chosen people descending straight from God himself, and shining upon the Eastern Saxon house. A genealogy of these kings was prepared, we know this, in Essex in the 9th century. Unfortunately, the surviving copy is partial. It's part of it's gone lost, so we can't know that much. But this naturally shows you how, at the time, the Anglo-Saxons, and especially because of the very complicated intertwinement of their groups, were quite interested in their origins. We've seen it just the other day for the Longobards. There was a very strong interest in properly the sense of common ancestry that would define better the identities. These were the West Saxons, but they, of course, felt also for these eastern neighbors, and it was a matter of nobility at the time, right? So, especially in a dynastic sense, really, that information was important to preserve. As we were saying before, however, there were surely at some times in Essex history multiple rulers, multiple monarchs, right, each in their own milieu, let's say, exercising authority over different parts of the country. Now, the first recorded king of Essex from the East Saxon king list was Esvine, or Erkenvine, to which a date the aforementioned 527 for the start of his rule is given. We do not actually know this for certainty. It's actually the only date that we have about his reign. However, we take it for what it is. Just Sled of Essex is listed instead as the founder of the royal house. By other sources, this ruler should have been around the end of the 6th, the beginning of the 7th century. Another interesting aspect is, just like the Sax, almost all the rulers of the East Saxons names, by the way, began with S, so that the capital letter used as nomenclature doesn't actually help much distinguishing them historically for whenever we have this abbreviation. In any case, we understand that locally a monarchy of some sort started. We see the East Saxon monarchs issuing coins that echoed, interestingly enough, the ones of the pre-Roman Brittonic leader Cunobeline, right, of the 1st century AD, that have very specific design. This guy was ruling, in fact, on the Catuvellauni and the Saint Trinovantes, so more or less in the area where these Saxons were ruling. So they probably had found, together with the Roman era currency, also the pre-Roman Celtic one, and they acquired a little bit the style. And part of the reason was to assert independence from Mercia, all right, because Cunobeline had ruled mostly in this southeastern area as, say, king of the Britons at the time. But he controlled, in fact, just this quite important tribes, of course. Still, of course, in the early Middle Ages, the southeast, just like ever, of Britain, is the richest, is the closest to to the other major polities surrounding it across the channel and so on. So this was a bit of saying, look, we are continuing basically what this early grandeur of the area was, at least in terms of what it still is, in terms of wealth. We've seen it for the Kentish that controlled a big deal of the traffics with the Merovingians, were de facto their clients in Britain, while Mercia was a bit more of a, it had, of course, sea trade, but was a bit more of a continental, merely a terrestrial mainland power. So the process of East Saxon power consolidation, politically, territorially, has to do with the same Christianization. In a context that, as you know, was pagan, at least from the Germanic side, and that had locally witnessed the ruin in previous and also during this time partly of the established church local, right? We think that Christianity flourished in this region around the 4th century, so as early as Constantine granted the freedom of worship with the Edict of Milan of 313. We find some indications. There is almost surely a church at Colchester dating sometime after the 2nd decade of the 4th century, so we're pretty much there. There are key row symbols around, including one etched on a tile at the site in Wickford, a gold ring still with the key row monogram at Brentwood. These are all, again, localities. The first one at 30 miles from London, the second in the actual London commuter belt. So it's the general area, and again, it's rare that there is even the chance to document sometimes in such relatively narrow, not much in this case, but spaces, but about the specific sign. In any case, we know this land had been Christianized, right? But Anglo-Saxon Britain at large came to be at least ruled by pagans for a while. So we think that, of course, if the majority of the people maybe wasn't Christian, however, still those who didn't flee remained. So nor there were particular persecutions, right? Even if the Germanic pagans thought that they were somehow the better ones in virtue of their faith, still they wouldn't care in that sense for somebody having this inferior belief from their perspective, just working for them and so on. But we know that Christianization was unavoidable considering the international situation, and it would bring great advantages to the system. Bede, in his Historia Ecclesiastica Gentis Anglorum, notes the arrival of the aforementioned Mellitus, later Saint Mellitus, shortly after 604 in Essex. This helped the conversion of the local king Sebert, who was the son of the aforementioned Sled. He was the first East Saxon king, to our knowledge, to have been converted to Christianity. At that time, King Ethelbert of the Kentish, that was the overlord of southern England, according to Bede the Venerable, was also involved in the broader connection with the activity of the missionaries, and it is shortly after the same advent of Mellitus that Ethelbert's nephew, Sebert, king of the East Saxons, this was the son of Sled, was converted to Christianity. This is interesting because it shows like the Kentish let's say openness to the evangelization, the fact that this neighbors were ready for that as well. They understood the advantages of it. By the way, it was Ethelbert and not Sebert who built and endowed St. Paul's in London, right, where the St. Paul's Cathedral today stands, which shows in the process the degree of Kentish power over the same East Saxons. The fact that St. Paul was in Londinium still one of the most important ecclesiastical centers in the region, and endowing it and showing how it was done. Well, it was a way to essentially increase the grip on the locals, to just invest something in this bordering polity, right, to a personal title. Like these monarchs acted very awarely of the floating balance, right? The same Kent had this exploit, but wouldn't rise to further dominance in England. But to them, really, it was a matter of personal power and prestige, right? In fact, Bede the Venerable describes Ethelbert as the same Sebert's overlord. And so already at this time, the East Saxons were under somebody else's hegemony. Sebert died in 660. At this point, there was, as often happened in the Anglo-Saxon realms, a temporary reversion to paganism. The reasons were obvious. some of the East Saxon establishment wanted to maintain the power connected to the pagan shrines and sanctuaries and under the name, say, the respect of tradition, but factually having a lot to do with their own personal clanic power within the system. Founding, say, or at least, endowing, like in this case, pre-existing ecclesiastical, in fact, patrimony, equated to actually win in that context, because these were permanent infrastructures. They had to do with, a very different form of government to the one that existed in central, say, northern, non-post-Roman Europe. And this clash was not even over religion per se, but again, this power dynamics, we've seen it very often also in other contexts at this point. The fight between, Arianism, Catholicism, was mostly instrumental just to also outer balance, say, the monarch and one of the nobility, rather than the actual personal belief, right? There were some of these Christian, say, this monarchs who converted to Christianity were not necessarily better or especially more convinced Christians than some of their opponents, right? Plus, it was not really an issue for a pagan to be contemporary that and a Christian in their own way, naturally. But again, there was an actually high degree of compatibility for universal reasons. In this case, that again, this is a bit my crusade. I always say, even as a provocation, but not really in the kind of hyperbolic sense, that people still believe that there was something like before paganism, polytheism, and then there was monotheism that canceled paganism. Like, okay, we will make other videos on the topic, right? Because the thing is much more complex, but also much larger than within itself than one normally thinks or is told. In this sense, consider what we just said about the Kentish influence in Essex, right? Obviously, fighting against these guys who had come and imposed some sort of fact of religious conversion, at least with their own means, on the East Saxons, was seen as an intolerable form of interference. Again, this backlash took on the form of an anti-Christian resistance, but surely there was plenty of Christians within this front that just wanted to keep the Kentish out of their East Saxon abodes. In any case, the kingdom of the East Saxons reconverts to Christianity under Sigebert II, known as the Good or the Blessed Bonus et Sanctus. This conversion follows Saint Sed's mission. Sed was an Anglo-Saxon monk and bishop from the kingdom of Northumbria. So actually that some of the most important missionary activity came from even the northern, from the Celtic fringe, actually, like, and pouring in from the north or the west into the pagan Anglo-Saxon England. On this occasion, Cedd had established monasteries at a certain Tillaburg in the sources, which could be East Tilbury, which is under the authority of Thurrock Borough in Essex, but the other possibility is also West Tilbury in the same district. And Ethan Cester, that even though we can't be fully sure about it, is likely Bradwell-on-Sea, right? A village and civil parish in the same Essex. We have a royal tomb at Pritwell, discovered in the early 21st century, The finds include gold foil crosses, right, which suggest that the occupant was Christian. Again, there was a lot of syncretism, but there were ways you could transform Thor's hammer into a Christian cross. But again, the overlapping of values was much closer than you've usually been told. In any case, we don't even know whether it's properly a kinged one bird there. If so, given the timeline, this could be either Sigbert or Sigbert. The latter was murdered in 63. For that matter, it could be really anyone in the aristocracy, right? We don't have any consistent proof this was just a monarch per se, but it tells you also the general tone of the nobility. Essex had a further pagan backlash in 660. This always had to do with, when we talk about this reverting back to paganism or re-Christianization, it's all about what we know about the monarch's personal religious policy, right? So there is this pagan king, Swithelm, that ruled from 660 to 664. He converted just halfway through his short reign. He was succeeded by his two sons, that was Sigere and Sebbi, and a plague that in that same year struck Essex caused Sigere and the East Saxons to come back to paganism once again, right? So you see this uncertainty, right, for reasons that we can't quite delineate specifically, but again had to do with these mechanisms of power. Bear in mind, again, there were different monarchs probably. These are just the most important of the Eastern Saxon core land. So the idea was Woden punished us because we betrayed him for this other rights and so on. So let's go back to him, right? However, there you have somebody who dislikes this from the external. That is the Mercians. Wulfhere, or Wulfar, king of Mercia, essentially suppressed this pagan coming back, which had to do pretty much again with this broader international situation too, and in fact established himself as overlord in among the Eastern Saxons. Bede describes Sigere and Sebbi as, quote, rulers under Wulfhere, king of the Mercians, so quite meaningfully. Wulfhere sent Yaruman, that was the bishop of Lichfield, a cathedral city and civil parish in Staffordshire, expressly to reconvert the East Saxons to Christianity. At this point, the Mercian power is rising. So again, this areas are gradually, this more peripheral areas in the southeast are losing their autonomy. By the way, this is a substantially late time in terms, especially with the Christianization of the southeast, right? That was the most civilized, the most affluent in general. It was just a place where Christianity took root the easiest, right? So even the Mercians here are actually imposing on them. So in my opinion, it has to do, in this specific case, we have seen other Anglo-Saxon polities at this time that at best like reconverted back to paganism after the first converted king died, right? And then they just remained, they converted again to Christianity for good later without waverings. This may have to do with the say, monarchic profile of the East Saxons. The fact that they were actually not necessarily more unstable as a country, right? We do not know of, again, particular ravages at this point or so on. But again, it was more difficult to keep together as a single thing. So this didn't help in general. The religion was a card they could play politically just to move power around. Now we have the local bishops wine in 666. We're talking about the bishops of London, right? Erkenbald in 675. These were appointed with spiritual authority over the East Saxon kingdom, right? That's how London was playing in the area. Fascinatingly enough, before the Great Fire of 1666, we are informed that in the old St. Paul's Cathedral, right? So what was built actually in the 11th century, right? From the 11th to, like most cathedrals in Europe, as you know, in the over some other century, but at that point was visible because it had been preserved there, a small stone chest bearing the name of Sabe of Essex, right? So this had belonged to the earliest St. Paul's, and even it was essentially placed there in Norman times, and Sabe ruled, as we've seen, between 664-683, right? So we know from the German lawyer Paul Hensner, as it was eventually translated by Sir Robert Naunton, an English writer and politician, right, who also sat in the House of Commons at the time of James I, of an inscription that translated reads, "Here lies Seba, king of the East Saxons, who was converted to the faith by Saint Erkenwald." So we are in the end of the 7th century. Bishop of London, in fact, AD 677. Right, and this was still visible, right, at the time of Hansnat, that was living in between the 16th and the second half of the 16th and the first half of the 17th century. Such inscription on the chest, right, the stone chest. So this thing dated back to the actual Anglo-Saxon times. It was evidently connected to the past of London, as the local East Saxons, Saxon monarchs had decided just to be recorded and celebrated in their final conversion to Christianity in St. Paul, right? Consider that London and the rest of Middlesex were lost by the East Saxons themselves in the 8th century, right? Because again, the power of Mercia, Wessex, and so on. However, London, the Diocese of London, continued to exert its spiritual authority over the East Saxons as a realm, right? And later, as we will see, as a shire and a county, until the redrawing again of the pertinences in 1845. So we know of some East Saxon connections, especially with the Kentish, and specifically through the River Thames, that naturally was the major highway there, which led to the marriage of King Sled to Ricula, who was the sister of the King Ethelbert of Kent. Right? This guy was Bretwalda, according to Bede, the third Anglo-Saxon king to hold the imperium over the Epic. Right? So this tells you how well connected the East Saxon nobility and royalty really was at that point, but without much of a broader power. Even Kent managed to control. So for a brief period in the 8th century, the East Saxons included even West Kent themselves, because there had been a further fragmentation there to occurred because of this Mercian pressure, and then the general predominance of other powers. We know that during this time, the East Saxon kings that were, as we've seen, involved also in traffics, etc., issued their own scetas, their own coins, perhaps exploiting a bit the circumstances, trying to assert, namely, their own independence. They could do it like the biggest game was played elsewhere by this point, but they still, dwelt there as much as as better as well as they could. By the mid 8th century, however, merchant power, including had really taken over most of the region, right, including London. So that there was a rump of Essex, roughly corresponding, in fact, to the modern county, as the rest was simply eroded, eaten up. And even this core land was subordinated to Mercia. When Beowulf was defeated at the Battle of Ellendun that ended Mercian supremacy, we are around 885 AD, the last king of the East Saxons, Sigurd, ceded, however, the kingdom to the other rising power, that is Wessex, specifically to its king Ecbert. Right? The Mercians wouldn't actually end just like that to exert control over parts of Essex, because they just were, at least historically, better connected. They also played this probably in an anti-Wessex faction. For example, they supported a pretender to the East Saxon throne, since Sigurd, named as Rex Orientalem Saxonum, is witnessed in a Mercian charter after AD 825. This is also connected to the local customs. Again, the fact that Essex was still somehow subdivided in various areas of influence with some leaders locally, so were surely internal competitions and things like that going on in the meanwhile. During the 9th century, Essex also came to be part of a broader sub-kingdom that included Sussex, Surrey, and Kent. While during the same century, the end of it, the territory was formally ceded by Wessex to the Danelaw kingdom of the East Angles. This happened in the treaty between Alfred and Guthrum, a peace treaty that, as you know, defined the boundaries fundamentally between the Anglo-Saxon kingdom as a whole. It was being affirmed, and the Norse who had settled on the eastern coast of Britain, which meant, given the position of Essex, that the area was relatively frontier now. So there were definitely different mechanisms from the ones of the early Anglo-Saxon era. The regions remained fairly prosperous, but also subordinated to other powers. Essentially the Anglo-Saxons would reconquer the land by the time of Edward the Elder, so that we are basically the beginning of the 10th century. and it's not before the following one that the Danes will essentially reassert a greater control, but still, again, substantially different situation, where the political and institutional system had been advancing, developing consistently, which made, at this point, Essex a shire. Right? This was regarded as such because the English king would appoint an elderman as a ruler of the land. The elderman was a high status guy who was practically given some also of royal birth, given the shires or some of them to rule as, generally speaking, the territorial lords on behalf of the king, like at the top level, right? So it under this control, Essex, ceased to be like a native monarchy, right? It just followed essentially the prevalence of Wessex, etc. However, it still was framed under the original, at least, what had been left, as we've seen, after the Mercian erosions and the other events followed to that, the core of the original East Saxon settlement, and essentially the one that had been essentially the core of the monarchy, and so following the local, say, unity, at least, also from an administrative point of view. So this territory that had an interesting, say, outlook, right? You have again this land stretching from the Stour River to London, to the Thames was the border actually, and having important monasteries as Barking, Tilbury. You have Colchester on the Colne River. You have Malden. Further ahead towards the sea, you had Broadwell, which was essentially part of a swamp over an alluvium territory. Then you have Wigan Gaymere in the further north. That was a bit the boundary towards the north, and mostly this open way towards the southwest, towards London, Middlesex, and other territories again of which the Saxons could exert some power. Right? It's a fairly composite territory. Of course, mostly they have this watershed from rivers, running into the North Sea, but they're also articulated. They take in the interland sort of quite composite pattern net outlook. Let's say that probably even helped connecting this broader land. Some are the Thames affluents in the south, at Barking, for example, it's an entity that historically existed as part of the Eptarchy, and that maintained a political and ethnic identity on its own, and that we recall for the sake of completion, even if, as you understand, nothing clamorous happened. But I like to at least picture all the various polities. You understand I'm circling a little bit around the bigger guys, especially Mercia, Northumbria, Wessex. So we'll talk surely at some point of Bernicia or something, but we'll also have to look at the bigger stuff. And when we will complete this series, we will also probably start looking at, for the rest, say,
that have the old cycle that I still have to resume, that looks at this various stuff in actual depth, mostly dynastic history, wars, whatever. But there is a lot for military history as well. Like, we haven't covered, I think of the Anglo-Saxon battles, just the Battle of Brunanburh. That was admittedly one of the most important, if not the most important, especially for that sense of properly of an English national awareness to emerge at the time against the various allies from the north against the monarchy. But there's this imperial dimension in the Anglo-Saxon culture that is also fascinating, because it highlights just the ambition towards a unitary rule, but also essentially the right of the Anglo-Saxons to rule all over the British archipelago, essentially since the very beginning of the settlement in England. This is curious because, again, there were different groups that didn't act unitarily, but they would recognize, of course, a sole ruler, and quite fast, at least an eminent ruler, right, that could assume this title of Bretwalda, etc., that Imperator, etc. At some point, even Basileus, right, which is fascinating, but because the Byzantine influence arrived up to the northwestern Europe, right? So these are all things that deserve an adequate consideration, and starting from these basics, like looking at who were the protagonists, I think is quite fascinating, and it adds to the completion of the picture, right? I like, as you know, to look at these regional realities exactly because they are the basis, right? Sometimes, especially in university, history is made in the guise of, okay, let's look at broader issues. But the literal ABC, the evidential history, what the hell happened, who were these people, what were the main power, you will never actually get it. You get all simplified things. So something a bit more complete and articulate, say, looking especially also at the map, right? Knowing what countries we're talking about. This is very important, in my opinion. Is crucial for whichever further historical inquiry can be carried out further. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.